I'm so appreciative of the institutions like Wells Fargo for their support in sustaining the YWCA Princeton's year-round programs and impacts. It's my pleasure to welcome Parlene Knight, Wells Fargo President and Senior Social Impact Sustainable Specialist, who will be introducing our panel tonight.
Thank you so much, Assemblywoman Reynolds-Jackson, for the wonderful introduction. Good evening, everyone. My name is Parlene Knight, Vice President of Social Impact and Sustainability at Wells Fargo, and I'm so glad to be here with all of you this evening for the 15th Annual Stand Against Racism Thought-Provoking Talks event. On behalf of Wells Fargo, we're proud to be a sponsor of this important moment and impactful conversation. And at Wells Fargo, we're glad to be among the top companies that recognize and promote the benefits of diversity. And we're committed to breaking bias in the workplace, supporting equity, and creating advancement in our communities. And we're also committed to partnering with organizations that share those values. And so I want to recognize the leadership and the staff and all the partners who contribute to the success of the YWCA and its work for a century now. A century, it's a long time that they've been working to help eliminate racism and empower women in such an impactful way. Now, I know that while many of us appreciate the fact that in the equity space, things are certainly changing, we also understand that the rate of change is not quite fast enough. And so as we continue to do the work as well as have the conversations to move forward, let us be brave and transparent enough to reveal our pain as we continue to work to face those challenges together. And let us not be willing to settle into what the current climate is, but rather press on to evolve it. And with that, now on to the panel. It is my privilege to welcome our moderators for tonight, Layla Wilson McCoy, YWCA Princeton Board Member and Mission Committee Chair and Manager of Organizational Initiative and Planning at Centurion, and Dwayne Williamson, Esquire of the Williamson Law Firm. And a big thank you to the panelists sharing their expertise and thoughts with us tonight, Monique Jones, Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Stewart Country Day School, Kendra Lee, Deputy Director of Programs at Mercer County One-Stop Career Center and Workforce Development Board, and Tehran Tyse Mcknight, Attorney, Policy Strategist in the Office of Governor Murphy and member of Trenton's Board of Education. Thank you to tonight's participants who are using your voice to make the world better for us all. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here in this moment with you. Thank you, and take it away, Layla and Dwayne.
Thank you very much, Parley, for representing our partners at Wells Fargo and introducing our wonderful panelists. A warm welcome to our attendees here tonight who are ready to learn more and take action in addressing this very crucial and relevant topic of critical race theory. We know that critical race theory came about in the 1970s through the writings of Harvard law professor Derek Albert Bell. It undoubtedly holds true in our society at all levels. Tonight, we are going to delve into how it impacts our educational system.
Well, thank you, Layla, for setting up that framework of what critical race theory is. I would like to address some common misconceptions we may see in media and politics. Throughout our discussion tonight, we plan to delve more into some of these misconceptions and where we go from here. Some of these misconceptions include critical race theory vilifies whites and victimizes minorities, or that critical race theory is diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI for short, training, or that critical race theory is being taught in K through 12 schools. And lastly, that banning critical race theory teaching in schools will prevent division among racial lines.
Thank you. These are some great things to keep in mind throughout our discussion tonight. I'd like to let us get started by introducing our impressive panel who are here with us tonight. We would like to ask you all one question to start off. Can you please share a little about yourself and why the conversation about critical race theory is important to you? I'd like to ask Monique to go first, then Kendra, and then Tehran.
Right. Thank you. Good evening, everyone. I am looking forward to this conversation. That was what was already shared. I am the Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Stewart Country Day School in Princeton, New Jersey. And I'm also Associate Therapist with Princeton Family Institute, where I work with youth, families, and adults. But the job that gives me both the greatest joy and headache is being a mother to a creative, intuitive, loving, beautiful 15-year-old girl who unapologetically marches to the beat of her own drum. And if I could use one word, I think that summed up all of my roles, all of the different hats that I wear, it would be advocate. I have always questioned what didn't seem right to me. I've always had a heart for those who were looked over or ignored and mistreated. And so the conversation around critical race theory is important to me because I think it helps me to better understand why my advocacy is necessary. It's also important to me because I think it speaks so tangibly to what I believe is a sociocultural dilemma we are currently in. As someone who is in the education field, where my role is helping to shape the minds of our future leaders of the world, I want to know and believe, I believe it's important that our future world is going to be filled with minds that seek truth, the full truth, and desire to live ethically. And so that is me, and that is why it's important to me.
So good evening. I believe that I am next. So my name is Kendra Lee, and thank you for having me. I'm so happy to be here. I am a wife. I am a mother of 4. And to provide context, I have 3 young adults, 2 college graduates, 1 graduating next month, and I have a little guy. I also am the Deputy Director of Programs for the Mercer County One-Stop Career Center and the Workforce Development Board. There, I work with the unemployed, the underemployed, I work with youth and vulnerable populations, but I also work with employers. And so that's very important because I get to shape conversations, I get to bring about economic opportunities, and hopefully also impact social justice. I also volunteer through Positive Black Images Connect. I'm the vice president of that board, and I am a long-term member of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. And there I work with youth. I mentor youth, co-ed, little people, elementary age, as well as middle school girls and high school girls. Recently, I was able to host a Girls Summit along with our esteemed Assemblywoman, and we were able to reach girls around the country. So I am very tied into the community. I'm very tied into this work. And I'd also like to mention that I too am a Y girl. I went to the Y as a little girl. And even as a young high school teenager and college student, I worked there. So I believe in the work and I am a lifelong supporter. I believe that critical race theory is important because it shapes who we are. It impacts us in education. It impacts us economically. It impacts our careers. It actually impacts almost everything that we do and that we touch. And we are responsible citizens to impact the future generations. So we owe it to them to get it right, to change this narrative and make sure that the future is better and it's brighter. So again, thank you for having me, and I look forward to this discussion.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am extremely honored to be here with you today, along with our esteemed panel members. I cannot wait to dive into this conversation. I am Tehran Tyse Mcknight, and as introduced by Ms. Knight, I'm an attorney and policy strategist and mainly focused on human services and social services safety net issues, particularly for disproportionate communities that are historically impacted by inequalities and racism. I am also a member of the Trenton Board of Education. I consider myself an advocate, especially in the special education realm. I am particularly interested in critical race theory, and I echo my board members that one, not only as an attorney, because I'm very intrigued about the legal and legislative framework in which critical race theory is being structured, in addition to the political framework that's being developed that, to be honest with you, worries me, and worries me to the point that they're impacting our children access to equitable education. And as a parent, like my esteemed panel members, I have a 2- and a 4-year-old. And I'm very concerned that their peers will be limited in the way they're able to critically develop their minds. As parents, our job is to develop change agents. If they're not getting access to a full and quality and diverse and rich education, how do we expect to have forward progress?
So I come from both of those perspectives, and be glad to share with you that information today. I'm not a Y girl, but I did meet my husband at the YWCA. So hats off to the Y for making those connections, truly and very much appreciated.
Well, thank you, Monique, Kendra, and Tehran. Our first panel question tonight is directed towards Monique. There are 5 states, Idaho, Iowa, Oklahoma, Texas, and Tennessee, that have recent legislation banning certain history teachings. How do schools in New Jersey teach American history as it relates to racism, slavery, and segregation?
Yeah, excellent question. Schools are teaching the facts, the historical facts. And so while independent schools may have more creative freedom to teach the subject matter, and public schools are very much guided, right, by New Jersey's student learning standards, which includes, right, content found on standardized assessments, AP exams, many of those different frameworks. But I think we also have to think about the developmental stages of students. Any theoretical discussion is going to be abstract, right? And so when you think about students and children and the development of their brains, any abstract discussion would be lost, right? So we just want to get through the cutting of shapes activity sometimes, right? Without students cutting their hair. But of course, right, once we get into the high school grades and higher level or more advanced courses, those discussions are able to be approached. But again, it's limited and not to the degree at which I think so much conservative protestation has suggested. Any discussion in the K through 12 grades is much more about the what, right? What it is, why it came to be, how it's impacting us right now. And similarly, history is taught as that, right? What it is, right? This is when it happened. This is who did it. This is how it impacted society and who. And I think this is building the content foundation or knowledge base, so that if students desire to go deeper later in their graduate or law degree studies and begin that theoretical, that abstract deep dive, which is really answering the question of why, right, these things occurred and why the impact, then they are prepared to do so with that base. But K through 12 schools are mainly focused on that what. But if it's a good school, like I said, like I believe, then it is teaching the what while still leaving room for students to ask the question of why on their own. Because what we should be more concerned about is not whether students are learning CRT, but rather are they learning CT, critical thinking. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much for that answer. I'm going to turn to Tehran now. These bills being passed in other states include arbitrary language and restrict teachers on what they can do and say without facing legal actions themselves. How does this directly impact students, and what inequities result from the approach to education?
So let's just give some context to this. So as mentioned, since 2020, there are roughly 32 states that have either passed legislation, attempted to pass legislation, or have recently introduced legislation prohibiting discussions of racism in K-12 settings. The problem with these bills are multifold, and one being the strict language that's referenced in the bills. So if you take a look at them, some of the bills that are referenced are prohibiting critical race theory. And as we just discussed, this is really odd and really concerning because it is based on the assumption that critical race theory is even taught in K-12 settings. And generally it is not, which then begs the questions to teachers and administrators, what is really being prohibited? So you have these laws that are being very arbitrary, subjective, very broad about what is being prohibited versus what is not being prohibited. Is it a reference to slavery that's being restricted? Is it a reference to Jim Crow? Are we talking general discussions about diversity and inclusions? Are we talking about concepts of white privilege? No one seems to know. You know, if you look at the direct language of these bills, there are some that have definitions of what they mean by critical race theory. But if we start with the assumption that critical race theory is not being taught in K-12 settings, then what exactly are they referencing here? And if that is confusing to me, I am sure that is confusing to our teachers. Our teachers they have anxiety, they're confused. They do not know how to answer questions that are being posed to them from their students because they're worried about the liability that could come along with speaking about these issues. And we can talk about some of those mechanisms a little later, but you also find in these bills, there's specific language, for example, that says schools are prohibited from talking about divisive concepts. Well, what exactly is a divisive concept? What's divisive to you may not be divisive to me. And we know the meaning of that is, and it's interesting because if you look at the political framework of this, Donald Trump has mentioned various times, has even mentioned this in an executive order, that any instruction in schools that makes a particular race feel superior or inferior to another race is a form of abuse and should be restricted. So we're talking about divisive concepts. We have, again, political framing of what this could be, but just really not knowing what a true definition of a divisive concept is. So again, what are teachers being asked? And teachers are having, honestly, they're backed into a corner. You have some of these laws who are rescinding teacher certifications. You have some laws who are threatening to hold teachers liable for up to $10,000. There are some laws that gives parents the right of action to school districts. There are some laws that are even talking about withholding funding from schools, essential funding that perpetuates and operates the school's curriculum. So this is very harmful, and it's very concerning that we have such broad, these very broad and very arbitrary legislation that are passing and are being introduced. And we're talking about 60%, nearly 60% of the states. That is very concerning. And the reason why it's concerning, and I mentioned this prior to now, is that if they are restricting education, basic facts about our history, then some students are not being given the full and comprehensive education that they deserve. They're being restricted from receiving equal resources, which is then creating further inequities in our educational system if some are not given the opportunity to learn American history. And when we're talking about African-American history, we're talking about the descendants of those in the African diaspora. We're talking about American history. So you find that in those states, when those issues aren't being discussed, that those students aren't getting that full education. They aren't getting those critical thinking skills that's going to move us forward and make our children change agents for the future.
Thanks, Tehran. As a fellow attorney, I could really see the concern about such unclear policies. Well, our next question is directed towards Kendra. You mentor young women and girls through Delta Sigma Theta sororities mentorship programs. How do you address these issues with the girls you mentor and fill in the gaps for them from a lack of comprehensive historical education?
Okay. So like the previous panelists noted that teachers are kind of backed against the wall. So we're not. So we're able to talk about subjects that aren't necessarily discussed in typical K through 12 education and likely might not be discussed in some of these girls' homes, right? So our sorority focuses on a 5-point programmatic thrust. So we talk about mental and physical health. We talk about international awareness, political awareness, we talk about economics and education. So all very important. We have a curriculum that we follow, and then we are also able to fill that curriculum out based on what's happening in the world and what's happening locally, because we work with Mercer County youth. So we teach and talk about Black history, right? We highlight the powerful contributions of Black and Brown people, including the narratives that focus on pre-enslavement, right? Because, when we sit in schools, a lot of times they start talking about Black people as if we just started at the period that we were enslaved, and not mentioning the fact that we were kings and queens and we had our own economic empires. So these are teachings that we can talk about in detail. We teach about economics and financial literacy, which is very important. Right? We focus on the value of additional education, whether that is college or whether that is seeking a recognized credential in their preferred industry. We expose them to high wage careers, and we talk about STEM because we know our Black and brown children are not going into STEM careers at the same levels that our white counterparts are. And they are lucrative careers. You can graduate from college starting at $65,000, $75,000 a year. That is life-changing for someone and their family. So we want to make sure that they're aware of the different vocational opportunities that exist. We talk about scholarships and SAT testing. We share resources with them. We also give scholarships, book awards, as well as tens of thousands of dollars. And we know that college can be cost prohibitive for a lot of our young people, and especially when we talk about our citizens who come from the city of Trenton. So we want to make sure that they have access, right? They should have the same level of access that our kids in Princeton have, that our kids in Lawrenceville have. We want to try to provide equitable solutions to them. We also talk about social justice. That is very important to the sorority. We teach these young ladies and our little young men about advocacy, advocating for themselves, advocating for their people. We talk about voting rights and how important civic engagement is, and police brutality. And we have a session coming up next month where we're going to talk about juvenile justice. And we've invited some local judges to come in and have some discourse with our young ladies. So it's so much more than mentoring. We talk about the school to prison pipeline. So these are subjects that they're not covering in school, right? And I venture to say possibly not private or public education. And unfortunately, a lot of the parents, they're unable to talk about these subjects, whether they're just trying to survive and put food on the table and get to the next day, or whether they're just not comfortable or knowledgeable enough in that subject matter. So the good thing is locally, we have over 100 members in our sorority. So I can call on this vast network to come in, whether that's virtually or to sit down in person and to be able to connect with these young people and share with them things that they're not learning anywhere else. And so, our sorority focuses on community service. And so empowering these young people and, possibly changing the trajectory of their lives is just really important.
Excellent. Thank you, Kendra. It's very interesting to hear how you guys are addressing the disparities within particular in our communities. And one thing when you think about how CRT, what has been gained from it, how understanding what CRT is, meaning how that impact has impacted our community today to create these disparities. So I'm glad to hear that you guys are doing things to kind of change that, rewrite history. And I'm going to turn this next question over to Tehran, because this is great, because this is going to address how New Jersey is looking at righting some wrongs. And so we would like to know about the Yamasa Commission, right? It's been instated for some time, and Governor Murphy has recently reinstated it. Can you share some background on the Yamasa Commission and what it means for New Jersey in making important progress to righting wrongs?
Sure. So the Yamasa Commission is very important because when we just mentioned those 32 states that are looking to pass prohibitive teaching in K-12 settings about racism, you look at a state like New Jersey, which is one of the most diverse states in this country, and you take your hat off because we're really moving in a progressive way that's very honorable and understands the importance of understanding your past to be able to move forward in your future. So with the Yamasa Act, it was passed into law about 20 years ago in 2002. And the whole goal was to ensure that African and African-American studies was taught in social studies curriculum. This law also was very important because it supported teachers in giving them the professional development to understand how to better teach this particular curriculum and how it interacted with core curriculum standards. It also gave a public outreach requirement, which assisted the commission in being able to talk to the public about these issues, about why African and African American studies contributions to our history and our past are very important to teach in our schools. So this was really a big deal, and there were very few states that had something similar to the Amistad Act, but New Jersey was definitely one of the first. And the whole goal was to show that African American history is American history. And that was very important. So in 2021, Governor Murphy signed legislation that basically put some more meat behind the bone for the Amistad Act. And it included a number of sponsors and co-sponsors from our legislature, including our Assemblywoman, Valina Reynolds Jackson, who is here today. So we thank her for her contribution on this act. So what this did is it provided permanent funding as a line item on the annual state's budget, which is very, very important to have a commission that actually has some funding that can actually do something. So you put in some money where his mouth is. This legislation also really strengthened the Amistad Act by saying, not only is it appropriate for African and African American studies to be taught in your social studies curriculum, but it's very important that it is taught throughout the entire curriculum. So we're not just talking about this history in your civics class, or again, your social studies class. We're talking about in your math class. We're talking about how Benjamin Banneker contributed to mathematics, right? We're talking about how Black scientists like George Washington Carver contributed to the peanut and peanut butter and those type of issues. So we're making sure that that curriculum is infused in every ounce of your core curriculum standards, which is very, very important, because that again reinforces the idea that the contributions of African American people are contributions toward the development of the American fabric, right? So that's very important. The law is also important because it put pressure on our superintendents and boards of educations to really start thinking about how are you intertwining this in your curriculum. Some may argue that it's really distinctive and disparate on how people in different communities have been implementing the Amistad Act. So this reinforcement by Governor Murphy and the legislature really wanted to push back and say, okay, we've been here for 20 years. Now it's time to really get moving. And we're going to give you the support to do that. So this was very important to New Jersey, again, as being one of the most diverse states in this country. In Trenton, our population is majority Black and Latino students. The Amistad curriculum is very, very important to that population so they can have self-love, right, to who they are, so they can understand their important history. And then they can become critical and informed members of our society and start making the changes that we want to see. So the Amistad Act truly contributed to that. It's putting some more meat behind the bone. It's forcing the issue to show that New Jersey is the leader and continues to push the agenda of diversity and inclusion.
Thank you, Tehran. As Marcus Garvey said, a people without knowledge of its history is like a tree without roots. So full implementation of Amistad is extremely important to gaining a comprehensive education. Well, our next question goes towards Monique. Stewart Country Day School is a private school right in beautiful Princeton, New Jersey, where I most recently had the honor of serving as an elected councilman. Is there a difference between how private schools approach this topic versus public schools? And if so, what is the difference?
Yeah, with regard to whether it's being taught, no, right? We know CRT is not being taught. However, I think Tehran raised or highlighted an important part or understanding that American history is not CRT, but that it needs to be taught, right? American history, all of American history. And so I think the only difference that may come into play is where private schools, again, may have a little bit more creative freedom in their curriculum. And so without needing maybe to pass a bill, pass legislation, right, have a vote, are able to incorporate that African-American literature, right? Are able to incorporate those inventors and scientists from pre-K, kindergarten, all the way up, right? That Latino, Latinx conversation, right? Organically throughout all of those course subjects and classes, because we understand that it's part of the entire history. And so they are able to maybe have a deeper discussion, I think, when it comes to CRT, as to maybe the question is raised as to what it is, right? Why has it become so politicized in its relevance? Maybe that's where the difference is, because there's a little bit more wiggle room to have those to come off of the the curriculum track, if you will. But again, very much sitting or keeping to historical facts and including the full story.
Thank you for that. And I'm going to ask you to speak again, and I'm going to send this question to you and Tehran, actually. It's going to kind of, I'm asking you to dive in a little more to really what you just spoke to, because we want to understand, how do you take what we understand as critical race theory, which is a higher level, right, analogy of critical race theory. It's a higher level. It's not really broken down to K through 12 schooling. So how do we take what is learned from CRT and bring that to K through 12 in a way that they are able to absorb and understand, but not teaching critical race theory, just what is understood from that?
Yeah, I think it's for our K through 12 students, it's really about the building blocks, right? It's providing them the skills to do that work. And so how are we setting the foundation? Are we teaching students to be critical thinkers, right? Do we allow them to ask why, or to question practices and traditions, right? Even when they are our own. Are we teaching them to observe and pick out patterns and themes? Are we teaching them empathy, right? And relationship building? And then do we give them the space to practice all of those skills in the classroom? Stewart is a school, right, that prides itself on leadership and women and their voices. And it's beautiful until they raise their voice against you, right? And they're questioning you. And so are we allowing them the space to do that? Even when it includes our own pedagogy? And then are we prepared to answer them honestly and truthfully? Are we emulating that, right? Are we demonstrating that as the adults and teachers? Are we showing them what does it mean to sit in tension, right? To sit in those tense and spaces of tension, holding the fact that I can mean well, I can mean to do so much good, and yet still cause so much hurt and devastation, right? And demonstrating what does that look like to sit in that space of tension. I remember being in school and doing what I was told, right? And doing well because I behaved, I turned my assignments on time. And it wasn't until going to graduate school when I realized that I could argue against the teacher. So all of that time I missed finding my own voice, right? Understanding what is it that I actually believe in. And it was the most liberating thing, right? But so I think for K through 12, and then those are the students that excelled, right? In the graduate school level, those are who go on to the PhD level, the thinkers, that is who sets the bar, right? And so I think for the K through 12, it is helping to build those blocks.
Absolutely. I could not have said that better. I think it's important to understand that CRT is an academic and legal framework. And to understand theorizing through that framework, you have to understand systems. And, whatever is translated down to K-12 settings has to be age appropriate. I think about my children who are 2 and 4. Are they ready for a conversation about institutionalized racism? No, probably not, right? Absolutely not. However, I think they are ready for real conversations about diversity and acceptance and respect, because those are the pillars to creating a well-rounded human being. If we can focus on acceptance and respect, then everything else becomes very easy when we're talking about people and their differences. And when we're talking about, your middle and your high school population, it's important to recognize that these kids have access to information that we never had, the internet and social media and things of that sort. So they're having if they're not having the conversations, they've been hearing them, they're a part of the larger conversations, indirectly or directly, about racism. So how are we translating that into a school setting to where it's appropriate? And I think the panelists hit it directly on the head in terms of building critical thinking skills for them to question, well, why? Because if we think our children did not hear the conversation around the murder of George Floyd, then we're mistaken. They've heard those conversations. Then they understand that it was just more than a white policeman killing a Black man. Those conversations were very broader than that, right? You heard the news talking about institutionalized racism, the racism that may show up in our policies and procedures and our law enforcement. So now that we know they have access to this information, even if it's not being taught at home, how are schools then making that age appropriate to where we're not directly having them analyze through these academic frameworks, but they're able to talk about, well, why is this happening? And what can we do to ensure a system, a future, where that no longer happens? How can we make them engage and make them the informed individuals to be able to participate in this huge democratic process where they know they have the power to change circumstances and to change dynamics? And that is the true power of education, is to be able to empower and inspire young people to be agents of change. And those conversations are very necessary to do that.
Absolutely. Thank you, Monique and Tehran. Our next question is directed towards Kendra. Kendra, with your background in workforce development, how do these inequities translate into the workforce and workplace culture?
So there is intersectionality in CRT and DEI, and especially as it pertains to the workplace. So I know it's a different dialogue when we're talking about K through 12, but when we're talking about the workplace, it's not the same, right? Because there's a difference when we talk about adults in a workplace who are there to have a career and to earn money. Right? There are certain conversations that just may not be able to happen and you keep your job. And the goal is to keep your job and pay your bills and live a happy life, right? So when we don't teach CRT, we're not producing critical thinkers. And I think that's been said repeatedly because it's very important. We're not producing compassionate and knowledgeable people. We are not producing, I just heard the word respect, and people who can build relationships with others. But we're also not producing people who can analyze things and situations from an other perspective, and dare I say a non-white perspective, right? When we talk about the workplace and we're working with diverse populations, and diverse in so many ways, so beyond color, right? And so, you know, there are some people that don't understand that racism is not rare. It happens quite often. And depending on where you come from, where you went to school, who your parents are, what activities you were exposed to, you might not necessarily believe this, right? Because that's not the lens with which you see the world. So we cannot fix racial inequalities with DEI training, but DEI training can dive deeper, right? We can discuss racial disadvantages and look at disadvantaged populations and how do we provide equitable solutions. You know, hopefully we can have honest and, dare I say, courageous conversations in the workplace, right? And leaders can educate their staff and their teams on concepts that are foreign to them, concepts that they didn't learn in school, that they didn't learn with their peer group, who tends to be like them, right? Most of us gravitate towards people who are like ourselves, whether that is, you know, our vocation, our interests, our fraternal and sorority organizations, and, dare I say, our color, our religion. So we have to sit with others in order to learn, right, how to be different and how to treat people with respect and to be able to view the world, you know, in a different lens. So when we talk about workplace, we need people to understand the historical context that shapes HR policies, right, and practices. So we want companies to examine and, dare I say, change their recruiting practices and hiring practices, right? We want to look at the support that they provide and mentoring relationships and programs that they set up, and look at advancement opportunities. And let's talk about equal pay policies, right? I was watching Good Morning America today, and they gave an example of a white male and an African-American woman doing the same job. They have the same pretty much educational background and experience. And what he makes in 12 months, it takes her 17 months, I believe it said, 7 additional months, so 19 months to make that same wage. So what is that? Right? So that's gender, but that's also race, because we're talking Black women. And then when we talk Latina women, there was an additional 3 months on top of that. Right? So, you know, the leadership has to be comfortable in leading and having these conversations and then taking action within their own policies. You know, corporate leadership, they have to scrutinize their systems, they have to challenge assumptions, and they have to think critically and strategically in dismantling those unfair practices. And they want to create an inclusive community, right? And be able to look at that pipeline of new employees that they're bringing in and be able to make sure that it is representative of the communities, of all communities, right? And either the employees will get on board and they'll keep their jobs, or they'll go elsewhere because they can't stand the change and they don't like the discourse, right? So understand that these leaders have to be brave in order to fight the system, because there are many examples, countless examples of leaders who've tried to fight the system, whether they were bold in action or whether they were, you know, meek and mild and just trying to push the envelope a little bit forward. People are getting fired. Right? So we have to look at how do we support people who step out and do and say the things that we believe in, right? Who's there to offer them that next job or some, you know, consulting work, because people still have to eat. At the end of the day, it does get down to economics. So, you know, so equity, that part of the DEI, that equity part is really important when we're talking about the workplace.
Thank you so much, Kendra. It's so interesting how you threw a few things in there, and we're gonna turn this one over to Monique. You ended with DEI, and we are going to move that to another question. But I do want to point out how we went from Tehran in her last comments talking about education and training and teaching our younger generation to move and make a better future, but that does not remove us from doing the same thing right now, because this is why hopefully everybody that is on this call is here to learn a little more and see how they can impact our future. So we can't wait for the younger generation, but we have stake in the game right now too. So Monique, because we really want to know, because you know these two things kind of cross and they get muddled together, DEI and CRT. They are not the same, but they do intersect, right? So can you explain to us kind of what the difference is, where they are, where they cross? And I'll turn it over to you right now.
Yeah, so understanding first what DEI means, right? So we know that the D diversity is about numbers. How many groups of people, right, or certain groups of people do we have, right, in this institution, in this organization, in this space? The E equity, right, is about the allocation of resources and power. Who makes the decisions, who doesn't, whose voice has the power to impact change, right? And then that I, inclusion, is about who is welcomed into the room. And so all of this, right, the allocation of resources, the number, who is welcome, doesn't discuss or address why, right? It doesn't address why we are paying attention to the number of groups, or the need to reallocate resources, or even the need to include any other voice but my own, right? And that's where CRT comes in, however, right? Again, that's that next step, that next level, right? That higher thinking. And I would argue intersectionality piece comes into play, because DEI is the current movement, right? The current understanding toward addressing what CRT explores and brings to the surface.
Well, thank you. Kendra, you have children that are around college age. What power imbalances and barriers have you seen as students leave high school, matriculate into college, and then graduate to the working world? How do you see higher education addressing racism?
So when we talk about the imbalances, we're talking about, not having equal education, right? Going into college. So if you don't have equal education, you don't have equal opportunities. When we talk about the finances, right? The cost of college, it's a deterrent. When we look at, I think my son's university at the University of New Haven, when he started, was $55,000 per year. That's 1 year. So we got to look at how many young people start school and are unable to finish, right? Because, they may get money. There are a lot of scholarships that help first year students, but we got to get through 4 years and sometimes 5 years, right? And then even outside of the tuition costs, we're talking about the room and board. We have a high population of homeless people going to college. They're bunking in other people's dorms. They're staying with one family member and another because they can't afford the room and board. Let's talk about food insecurities, right? Because that meal plan. So maybe, you received some financial aid or some scholarship dollars, but you got the lowest meal plan. So you get 10 meals. I don't know about you, but I want 21 meals a week. I want 3 meals a day. So 10 meals across 7 days is not a lot of food, right? So, there's that. There's a digital divide. You have to have a laptop and internet access to be in college, to be in high school, even to be a third grader. Okay, my son is a third grader and he has a Chromebook, right, that I got on a big sale in the midst of the pandemic. And I'm glad that I was able to afford it because it made life easier working from home while he could work next to me on his device, right? But there are a lot of kids who are going to college without a laptop and they're working on their phones. Now, you can't do lectures and papers on a cell phone. I know our kids are talented with the cell phone, but you can't be successful at college using a cell phone. You need a laptop and you need the proper software. And sometimes there are lab fees for that. That's not necessarily covered maybe with financial aid or with, tuition. There's also just the divide of the network, right? I think there's the phrase, your network determines your net worth, right? So, if you do not have the opportunities and you're not exposed to people who are great thinkers and who have wonderful vocations and who want to talk to you and teach you, you may be surrounded by people who are in the same situation as you, possibly a low economic status, right? So how do you strive? Because that's why we go to college, right? I think, we go to learn, but we go to also just move our station in life, right? We want to go up a few social ladders, a few economic ladders. That's why we invest those years. And that's why we invest those dollars. And then let's talk about COVID, right? So COVID has just exacerbated all of those things that I just said. And it's made an even larger divide between the haves and the have-nots. So, my young people, I had 3 kids in college at one time. That's not easy. We did it. But, I brown bagged it a lot of days. Okay. So, but I also realized how fortunate we are because I was able to help my young people apply to college. But we have parents that I work with, whether professionally or through our mentoring groups, they don't understand financial aid forms. And, they may be fearful of giving their tax information because they don't know what you're going to do with it. Why do you need my tax information to apply for that program at the One Stop? Why do you need my tax information to apply for financial aid? Sometimes they don't give it out of fear and misunderstanding. So now this baby can't apply for financial aid because they don't have their parents' tax records, right? So that is a barrier. So, higher education needs to do more, right? They need to do more. They need to have socially relevant curriculum. So we were talking about that, right? They need to talk about civic engagement. Okay, because again, a lot of our young people, if they're just trying to survive, they don't understand voting and civic engagement, right? They don't understand that even, making a higher salary, you have better health outcomes. It impacts everything. You have greater opportunities. Colleges should have more diverse faculty and staff members, because again, as I said earlier, we tend to gravitate towards people who look like us. So if I have a Black woman professor and she's killing it in class and she seems open and compassionate, I'm more likely to maybe talk to her after hours and try to get some additional support and resources. I may not talk to someone else just because I might not be comfortable enough. I may feel like that person doesn't understand who I am. Right. Definitely more support in the whole, financial aid process in housing, right? How many kids, because they don't fill out the housing application right, they get accepted to college and it's 2 hours away, but I don't have housing. That's a roadblock. That's a real problem. Colleges can do equity audits. They need to check and see, and identify gaps of why students are underperforming. What's happening in their systems that they have a whole block of young people who are underperforming. Look at the degree completion. If you have a large number of, people of color who are not completing degrees, then what are you doing as an institution to remedy that? You should be proud of graduation rates. That should be a number that, you should be able to wear on your chest, right? So if you have kids who are not graduating, why is that? Why is that? If they're able to have emergency funds, I feel like, the government found all of this money for, things that happened with COVID. Well, that money existed before. Why aren't we putting that in our educational systems, right? So you were able to pull the money then, and I'm glad because people needed it, but we needed it before. And we need it moving forward, right? We got free lunch for our kids now. I hope that continues, right? So, so the educational institutions, they have the power, the authority, the finance to be able to address a lot of these inequities and make sure that our kids can graduate school and that they have opportunities, right? Because kids who don't have a network, they don't get the paid internships, right? When I was in college, I couldn't afford an unpaid internship. I had a little car. I needed to pay my car insurance because my mother was a single mother of 3 kids. And she said, if you want your car, you got to deal with it yourself. I'm helping with tuition. I can't do that. So I worked. So I didn't have paid internships, but you better believe all of my children had paid internships because I know better and I have a great network, right? So, that's how it works. So if we help our children, then the future generations are just going to be better and better.
Thank you so much. You touched on a whole lot that could open up a whole big conversation. Actually, all of you did. I'm so grateful to be a part of this and listen to this. And we are so glad that you guys are here. And for our attendees, thank you for being here. Do not leave yet. We are getting ready to go into breakout rooms so you can be a part of this conversation. Do not leave for fear. We are asking you to engage in the conversation at your comfort level. So please, you're going to go into smaller breakout rooms. There will be a facilitator there so you can engage. You have questions. You can build upon what you learned, what you heard here, your feelings, your reactions, etc. So in just a few moments, we will all go into a breakout room and we will come back. So don't hop off. Don't be scared. Don't hop off. Stay in the breakout rooms. We're going to come back and we're going to have Q&As with our panelists. So thank you and see you back in a few.
See you all in 20 minutes.
Feel very, very motivated. The conversation from the panel to our breakout rooms has been very inspiring. And right now we would like all of the facilitators of the breakout rooms to share a few takeaways, some action plans. And Karen was a facilitator in the breakout room that I was in, and I am inviting her to speak about what we discussed, not in detail, but just some of the key takeaways.
Yes, we had a nice group of members in our panel, as I'm sure you did as well. And we talked about, some of the things that we heard on the panel about the 60% of the states striking legislation that impacted critical race theory, which is a graduate and law school level topic. But, the funding and the right to sue by parents were impacting lower level education. We also talked about the understanding that there was concern about making people feel uncomfortable, in particular, how it impacted people of different races. And we also talked about how not having the full history be explained not only, was a tragedy for Black and Brown people to know their full contribution, but it was a tragedy for all because it's not a reflection of the true history. From a corporate standpoint and from a nonprofit standpoint and from an education standpoint, one of the actions is to have more transparency and metrics and to also develop an action plan to move the needle forward on really being more of an inclusive organization environment in
think that was your cue, Dwayne.
Oh.
To ask our next, whoever is next to talk about who was the facilitator in your room since your buzzer went off.
I'm looking, would that be Ms. Nash?
Yes, it was, Dwayne. Yes.
Okay,
it
go
was
ahead,
a
Ms. Nash.
Pleasure meeting you in the room. So we had a very interesting conversation with John, who works for ETS, and he has challenges bringing, the African-American and history, or the whole American or human geography to the College Board. And the other challenges he described was having with conversations with people he knows in other parts of the country that are very resistant to this, to bringing critical race theory to bear. The action steps that we came up with were perhaps instituting African-American AP courses as a gateway to CRT in higher education, and also just challenging people that we meet who have some resistance, just to talk to them about what their actual concerns might be and having face-to-face conversations.
Thanks, Kathleen.
Is there anything you think we should add to that conversation, Dwayne?
No, that was, you took care of it all. I think it's very accurate. And are there any other, I'm not sure how many breakout rooms we had.
Tatiana,
I can go
Tara.
next.
Oh,
Okay.
Thank you.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you again for joining us and for participating and engaging in these important conversations. I was in a breakout room with Mcknight and with Monique Jones, and the action step that we came up with was that it's wonderful that the YW has been able to have this event this evening, but we would love to see more lunch and learns at organizations. So Brahim is working on bringing those to his organization, and Monique was talking about implementing those into the school year calendar for Stewart Country Day School for next year. And one of the key things to take away from this is that we all now, we know panelists who are comfortable with these conversations, who will show up and will speak from their experience and are happy to answer questions. So after the event, reach out to the panelists and see if there's an opportunity to connect there and continue to spread this work throughout the community.
Thank you so much, Tatiana. Yes, that is very important. That is how we make change. And I am going to ask Tara to share the takeaways from her group.
Sure. Thank you. We had a great discussion in our group. And some of the action items that we talked about was first, making sure that we talk about what we learned today with people in our networks, because there is so much misunderstanding about these really important issues. Another thing is making sure that as we talk about them, we are not so binary and, not so black and white, so to speak, but we are very inclusive and looking at, the history of multiple marginalized groups in this country and incorporating their perspectives. A third thing we talked about was making sure that we, take our youth seriously and recognize that they deserve this full education and full perspective. And also that we recognize some of the challenges that will go into it because we don't know where our teachers are and whether they feel equipped and trained to provide this full educational perspective. So how can we support them and better understand that landscape as well? So as you can see, it was a great discussion, and thank you to all of our panelists and breakout group members.
Thank you. And thank you for talking about youth. I'm going to do a little plug for Friday. We have a youth rally. So anyone that has any children that are middle school through high school, please join us. Look at the website and have your young change makers join and share their voice. And I'm going to turn it over to you, Melanie, to talk about the takeaways from your group. Thank you so much, Tara.
Sure. Thank you, Layla. So Our group, in terms of a takeaway, what we all addressed was, or agreed to, was the need to lean into the discomfort of the need to lean into the discomfort and embrace when you are being challenged, especially by a young person, to Monique's point, and to embrace that opportunity for dialogue and questioning and developing a critical thinker. When it is appropriate and safe, given the right context, that could also be the case for an adult, but certainly that sense of safety matters. We also highlighted the importance of addressing critical race theory as it relates not only to schools, but also to the workplace, and really appreciated the dialogue tonight with the panelists and all of our participants. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Melanie. Yes, being uncomfortable creates change, and change means that you might be a little uncomfortable. So thank you for bringing that out and talking about that. I kind of say sometimes if you are in a conversation, especially about race, and you do not feel uncomfortable or a little bit thinking about what you're doing and how you're looking at life, it's probably not a real in-depth conversation. And so, sorry, but hey, it is what it is. So Jen, what are the takeaways from your group?
I'm glad to see that a lot of us were on the same page and having the same conversation, because to Nikki's point and to your point, Layla, get comfortable being uncomfortable. That's how you grow. That's how you learn. We talked a lot about inviting people to the table. Now that we have more knowledge and feel more comfortable ourselves, inviting people in and making that table bigger and having that conversation, and also continuing to do this work every day at every age and every stage in our lives, just being committed, because it does take all of us doing it every day. Even if it's just a tiny step, it all goes towards that bigger picture of making change.
I believe that may have been all of our not panel, but our breakout room coordinators. Is there anyone else? Okay, okay. By the way, I like that term, get comfortable being uncomfortable. So I may, start a new t-shirt business and put that on there. Okay, but what amazing action items and takeaways. At this point, I would like to now open up the floor for anyone to direct questions they may have to the panel. So please either submit your question through the chat or just use your raised hand feature.
I think there was one question that was in the chat prior to our breakout room. Yes. So I will pose this. It looks like this is for Tehran. We would love to hear more about divisive concepts. This is very interesting. So what can you shed some more light on the divisive concepts for us?
So, we can have a conversation all night about this. So this term first appeared in an executive order that Donald Trump passed in September of 2001. And this executive order was 13950, combating race and sex stereotypes. And the purpose of this executive order was to ensure that in federal workplaces, so it applies to federal agencies, federal employees, federal contractors, federal grant recipients, that they were not having trainings or professional development around race. And in this particular EO, he mentions the exact word of divisive concept. So this is where this phrase was first coined, was in this executive order, in which then President Donald Trump mentioned that any divisive concept should not be discussed in federal trainings. So it's interesting how this conversation of critical race theory now becomes a political conversation, because if you look at the legislation that I was talking about during our panel session, you see a lot of the legislation, the strict language of the bills referring to divisive concepts, which is very odd because it is not defined. So from understanding the arguments of those in support of prohibiting racial discussions, we can assume that divisive concepts are any concepts in which race is discussed, in which the one party feels guilty or bad, or it creates division between one party and the other party, which goes back to, again, a political idea that racism cannot be discussed in an environment where it's productive. The connotation of the executive order and a lot of the legislation that has followed with this term divisive concept has the assumption that any discussion about race, slavery, again, Jim Crow, all the laws that were factual laws, right, that came out of a lot of the movements, particularly civil rights movements, Reconstruction and on, are divisive, that they will immediately bring division between Blacks and whites, which is not true. We know that not to be true. So this term divisive concepts is very deceptional in that it is a perception that any discussion around race and racism will immediately lead to division. And we know that not to be true, but it's very scary and very concerning that we're seeing this exact language pop up in a lot of legislation, which then begs the question of this political narrative, political propaganda, rallying a certain voting bloc and using this language to simply, again, rallying a voting bloc, not necessarily because anyone really cares about education in K-12 settings. I hope that answered the question.
Yes, thank you very much. I think we just got another question. What are a few foundational steps that you would advise organizational leaders to take to dismantle institutional racism? So I think this can be posed to any one of our panelists. Are you gonna make me call you out?
I think I'll put one on the table.
Thank you.
I was gonna say, we talk about foundational, the DEI audit, right? DEIB, and starting with an audit, cultural survey, cultural climate audit. I think that's gonna provide and shed some light on practices, history that may remain there from hiring, marketing, branding. You're going to have someone come in and really have you sit and question organizationally, right? Very different components of that organization to help you maybe see ways in which to address the institutional racism.
Very good point. And I think that's why it's become very key in a lot of organizations now that they have DEI training as a way to at least bring that information in. And so people are aware of a lot of their unconscious bias, right? And how it's one thing to be diverse. It is a completely other thing to be inclusive, right? And so if there are any other panelists that would like to bring some more light or shed some more light on that question, please.
I would just jump in to say, organizational leaders should be very intentional about bringing certain groups, certain individuals to the table to where it's diverse. So I say that to say, if we're talking about breaking down institutional racism, we're talking about breaking down the system. We're talking about changing laws and policies. And in order to do that, you have to have the people at the table who's going to care. So when I say that, I mean our policymakers, our legislators, our board members, at every level have to include Black people, Black and brown people, have to include Asian Americans, have to include Latino Americans, have to include women. I mean, I have been, advocating for so long about certain people being at the table to start the conversation and start actually changing those policies. But if you have the same people at the table, then what? If you have the same people making the decisions, then what do you have? You have the same old, same old. But you have to start, if I had advice for organizational leaders, to start in being very intentional about layering your leadership team, putting people in positions putting people in elected position on board positions that show real intentionality about being diverse, because those are the people together that are going to work to break down the system. It's more, you got to be about it and more about just talking about it, right? You got to put the work in, and that's actually having representation at all levels of government, nonprofit, private, every industry in this country has to be correctly represented so those people can start to tear down those walls.
Thank you. Yes, opportunity is important. And as we're thinking about this concept, especially when we're talking about younger children in K through 12 and the next generation, representation, as you just mentioned, is very important in how it influences our young children in what they are capable of doing and where the places that they fit. If they don't really see people similar to them, they do not believe that they belong in those places. So thank you for mentioning that. Are there any other questions? Or I should actually be turning this over to Jen.
Thank you, Layla. Well, what a full and riveting conversation we've had tonight. On behalf of the entire YWCA Princeton team, thank you for joining us for our annual Stand Against Racism thought-provoking talks. I hope tonight's panel and breakout conversations have left you with a better understanding of critical race theory. I invite and encourage you all to stay engaged with our work. Our newsletter registration link and social media handles are being shared in the chat now, and we will also do follow-up to tonight. But lastly, thank you to our panelists, Monique Jones, Kendra Lee, and Tehran Tyse Mcknight for your time, passion, and expertise, as well as Layla Wilson-McCoy and Dwayne Williamson for guiding us through this important conversation. Thank you, and good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank
Good night.
you.
Good evening.